What is up, guys, and welcome to another midweek online. We're so excited to have you here. Make sure, as you're here on YouTube with us, you click like and subscribe. During the game, be active in the chat. Who do you think is going to win? Tonight, we are playing the Random Objects Shootout, made famous by The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. So we have some crazy objects over there. We're going to take turns and alternate shooting them and see who gets the most points. Each thing is worth 1 point. Our final object, which is the pitcher of ice, if you make that, it's worth 2. So let's get started.
Ice is melting.
All right, you can go first, Lefty.
All right, what are we doing first?
You decide. Just not the ice.
Frisbee.
Yeah.
Because I'm the worst at the frisbee. All right. For how many points?
1. 1
1
point per shot. Oh, get it. All right.
Ha!
Wow.
Oh, okay.
Okay, 0 to 0. What's next? All right, we're gonna go French's classic yellow mustard.
Oh boy.
This is gonna make a mess when we miss. I'm really excited. Okay. Oh, get in.
Oh.
Oh, man.
Oh. Now, I'm very sad because I don't know if any of our cameras are going to pick up the splatter on the ground.
It's a giant mess right now.
I feel like we should stop and put a slow-mo camera in. That'd be sweet, though. All right. That didn't go in, right?
That did not go in. I was just short. Oh, Nathan. Oh, and yours didn't break.
Mine didn't break open.
Sweet.
So
We could still use that. Hot dogs next week at youth group. All right, you're up next.
Noodle.
Noodle, okay. Nice. All right, there's a lot of wind out here, so here we go.
All right. Holy cow, we're going to have a tie.
0 to 0, everybody
0 to 0.
wins.
So it's got to be that one.
Oh, my
Oh.
cone is broken.
Okay.
All right, here we go. I had a good line, I was just short.
Okay.
Wow, we're really bad. Random object
If
shootout
you
fail.
guess nobody wins, I think you've got a good shot at this.
I think it's your shot. This is for victory.
Okay.
You got this. Oh! Wow.
Oh boy.
I don't know, I like that strategy, but part of me thinks, I don't know what to do. All right, I'm gonna go your strategy.
All right.
Here we go. Oh, Nathan wins again.
Second week in a row.
Oh
I win.
man.
I love
Hey,
it.
if you guys guess Nathan, you win because he wins. If you guess me, I'm sorry, I failed you 2 weeks in a row. Let's head into the youth room and let's have a little discussion tonight. We'll see you there. So tonight we're going to be asking the question that many of you have asked us: why do bad things happen to good people? And this kind of follows along with the conversation we set up last week. If you haven't had a chance to watch it, feel free to go back and do so. But the question of why do bad things happen to good people, Nathan, is one that I think we've asked forever. For like the history of humanity, I think everyone has been asking this question. And to start that conversation, I think we should look at the latter part of that question, the good people idea. When you hear this phrase, why do bad things happen to good people, what are your thoughts as it relates to good? Yeah.
So when we talk about good, I mean, I think back to the guy he came up to Jesus and he said, good teacher. And Jesus makes this interesting statement. He says, nobody is good except God, right? And so I think so often we think of ourselves as being good when from Jesus, he says nobody is good but God. And now, there's the theology of that, like Jesus is God, so he's referring to himself there. But this idea that we are basically good people, I think has a lot of problems with it. And that's the first place we go wrong when we ask this question about why do bad things happen to good people? It's this assumption of, well, when has that actually happened? Because are we really good?
Right. Several places in Scripture, it makes it very apparent that we're not good. Romans chapter 3, there's none righteous, and then for all have sinned. Right. So two very clear statements of we as humans aren't good and shouldn't label ourselves as good. And if
Right.
we don't have to just look at the Bible for that, I think it's pretty clear if we just look around. If we look in the mirror, it's obvious that we aren't good. And if we say we are good, I think we're lying to ourselves.
Right.
We're at least intentionally overlooking our flaws, our mistakes.
Yeah, and I think that this won't necessarily apply as well to you guys, but think about it as like a parent. Like maybe you think, well, people are probably born good enough and then they get corrupted, but I don't have to teach my kids how to misbehave, right? We didn't have to teach Asa how to say no. He learned no very easily and he yells it often. He still won't say yes. I can't get that kid to say yes, but he knows how to say no very well. Like this idea that, there's goodness in us
Right.
is a flawed beginning point, I would say.
Yeah, if you put a couple of young people, I'm thinking like toddler age, in a room together and then give one of them a really cool toy or a delicious piece of fruit,
Right.
there's going to be a lot of selfishness shown in the next 30 seconds that you let those kids interact.
Right.
And I don't think, you're right, I don't think they're necessarily taught that. It's in our nature. And so with that, if we then take out the good people part, because I think we can all agree those don't exist. If you know of one, let me know because I'd like to meet them. So let's just take that first half then. Why do bad things happen?
Right. And so then that's such a huge topic right there. And it's like, if God is in control, why would he let bad things happen? And this kind of piggybacks, like you said, off what we talked about last week with our current situation, but throughout any time, pick any terrible thing that's happened and you can say, why would God let that terrible thing happen? Yeah. And so I think there's a lot of different ways to answer that. And I think part of the answer to that lies in this idea that God is bigger than ourselves and has a bigger perspective than we could ever have. And so a lot of that will come into, is there a possibility that God has good reason for letting that happen? And without the eternal perspective, we have no way of ever knowing that.
Yeah. When I think of bad things, obviously the first place my mind goes is the garden, right? Garden of Eden, Genesis chapter 3, the fall of man, where it happened, where a decision was made because God, in his love for his children, gave them the ability to choose.
Right.
And so you have this opportunity to choose obedience or disobedience, and unfortunately, our ancestors chose disobedience. I don't blame them, though, because I'm pretty certain I would choose the same thing when given that same choice, knowing what they knew at the time versus what we know now, right? And so because of that, a curse came upon us. We now are fallen and broken. I had mentioned it last week in Romans. There's a lot in Romans about this problem of the bad things happening in the world, right? And so the fact that through one man, through Adam and Eve in the garden, what happened there, sin entered the world.
Right.
That's all of us. We are now all fallen and broken.
Right.
And so bad things happen because we are not good people and we are not making good choices.
And we live in a world that is broken at this point.
Right. We had this discussion a little bit on the chat last week about this virus itself being, man-made or God-made, natural versus man-made, what that means. It was a super short discussion, but I think it goes back to, because of this fallen, broken world we live in, we have these devastating things that can happen naturally because of decisions that humans have made throughout history.
So in the very immediate sense of it, bad things happen because we live in a broken world. And honestly, it's a very bleak outcome, but that could be the end of it. God could say, yep, you guys, you made the wrong choice. Now enjoy your consequence. Right? And that would be a very sad story. And fortunately, it's not the whole picture. And I think sometimes we stop there. We just say, yep, the world's broken.
Right.
We deserve it, and that's the end. But again, it comes back to this: God's perspective has everything in mind, not just from what we see. And so, if you understand that God has a purpose behind it, and He's got a plan of redemption that's not just for us, but for creation, and that this all fits into this bigger and better thing that's coming, then it makes more sense to say that God has allowed this to happen because it will lead to this ultimate redemption through what He's done. And I think of it, again, going back, and you may have heard me tell this example before because I go to it a lot, but it makes me think of, with kids, because I've got kids, when they're really little, one of the things we do is we get them their vaccines and their shots. And from his perspective, what my son sees, he's 2, we take him to a place, we hold him down while they plunge a piece of metal into him, and he's screaming and saying, he sees me as the person who's supposed to take care of him, and I'm helping hurt him right now, right? But it's because I've got this perspective that I know what measles and things like that are like, and I know how terrible that could be. And so I say, you know what? Because I will let you go through this little bit of pain right now, because the benefit far outweighs anything that you're going through right now. And I think if we were to magnify that on as big of a scale as you can imagine, we can get just an idea of God's perspective in this.
Yeah, and as you talk about that idea that God has an infinitely larger understanding and perspective and sees the big picture that our finite minds cannot. To play off of what we talked about last week with Thanos, I'm reminded again of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? And I think of Doctor Strange when he's sitting there doing his creepy little meditation thing, and yeah, it's just odd. But then he says that he looked into the future options of what things are looking like, and there was like 14 million and 6 or whatever, and there was only one way that this would end in good.
Right.
And that one way required Doctor Strange to do the one thing that he said he wouldn't do, which was get rid of the time stone.
Right.
Right. And so to Tony Stark's mind, when he saw that, he was like, that was the dumbest thing you could do.
Right.
But Doctor Strange had an infinitely larger perspective, and he saw the good that would come through suffering.
Right.
And so with God, my finite mind, I just see suffering. And especially when we're in the middle of that suffering, we don't understand what could possibly happen there. But God sees everything and allows this suffering for a time so that through perseverance, we come out the other end stronger, right. Potentially better witnesses for Him.
Right.
And ultimately, what we talked about last week, there's even a bigger picture beyond that when we talk about our eternal destination, right. Heaven versus hell, right? And so suffering is allowed now in this time, but that's going to end eventually for
right.
those who trust in Jesus,
right.
and what He did for us.
Right, and I think that it's almost even bigger than that, right? Yeah. Because we talk about you talk about what happens when you die, right? We talk about heaven or hell, but even that is only a temporary heaven and hell right now. And you might not have heard that before, and that's something that we don't talk about. Like, Lex gives me a hard time whenever I say temporary heaven. It's like, where does it say temporary heaven in the Bible? And I said, well, it doesn't say that word for word, but the concept's there. And it's this idea that ultimate eternity is in this restored and resurrected earth, not just us, right? And so, Colossians, we talk about like how God gets here, right? In Colossians 1, it talks about Jesus. 1:19, it says, "For in Him, Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through Him to reconcile to Himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of the cross." And so a lot of times whenever we've had these conversations, you might have heard, I might sound like a broken record with this, but I always go back to the cross and the resurrection, right? And that makes sense. That's the focal point of Christianity, I think. And this idea that through the cross, through His death and resurrection, it says God is reconciling everything. It's not just, all right, because of Jesus dying, I get to go to heaven. But because of Jesus' resurrection, all creation will be restored at the end into this eternal new heaven and new earth that we see in Revelation 21, which I won't read right now, but read Revelation 21 if you want this picture of like this restoration of how things should be.
Yeah, that's good. It reminds me of 2 Corinthians 5, where we're reminded that the one good, Jesus, right? The one person that we can point back to and say, yes, that's good. He is good. He became sin, right? Who knew no sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God. Right. Like, it's because of his perfect, sinless life that he lived, and then that suffering he had to go through, the bad thing that happened to the good person.
Right.
But the point of it was this ultimate restoration of creation back to God.
Right.
And the way it was originally designed before we made the mistake and the choice. And
we talk about, kind of circling it all the way back to the beginning when we talked about bad things and good people. If we can look at what God allowed to happen here, which was the worst thing, right? Because if we say Jesus as God is the only person who was actually good, and then what happened to him, the torture and crucifixion, was happening to the only good person, the worst thing that could happen, and yet God uses that for the best news ever, as Rick would call it in his gospel
in the
series.
current series, yeah.
Right? That God would take the worst thing that could ever happen to the only good person that would ever happen and bring out good from it. How much more then can we trust him in anything that we see in our lives that's bad pales in comparison to how bad that was, and yet God used that. So we can trust him to use everything bad that happens in our lives for his good and our good as well.
That's good. That's good. So we briefly, Nathan, had talked about prior to this idea of the problem of evil.
Right.
So let's, as we're kind of wrapping up this conversation tonight, let's look at that, because I think that does put this gap between people and God.
Right.
Right? If there is a good God, why does evil exist?
Right.
But then also, even as those of us who trust and believe that there is a good God, sometimes this idea of evil, it puts this little gap there in my relationship with him.
Right. So, and this is where we get in the most like apologetics-y of this, which I really like. I love this whole, and if you don't know, apologetics, it sounds like you're just saying you're sorry for something, but it's defending what we believe, right? It's the process of defending it. And so when we talk about the problem of evil, they actually use, there's a full term for it. It's called theodicy.
We planned that.
Yeah. And it's this idea, because I will hear people, like you said, that this gap between belief in God, and people who don't believe in God will say, it's impossible for there to be an all-powerful, all-good God and for evil to exist. And so what this really breaks down into, there's two basic areas that we can talk about this when we talk about theodicy, and or the problem of evil, and it's the logical problem and the emotional problem are the ways that I would break it down. And so when we lay out these things where we say, for any of you who have ever done like a formal like logic or debate type thing where it's like you lay out your premises and you get a conclusion, it's like, the logical problem of evil is an all-good God exists, an all-powerful God exists, evil exists, and one of those can't be true. It's kind of how it's usually laid out. And so I think the answer to that, and so often I hear this as if it's like a brand new discovery. Somebody will say, well, Christian, can you answer this? And it's like Matt said, this has been a discussion for
Ever.
I mean, go back the book of Job. That's the entire point of it is Job seems to be a good person, but God allows bad things. And we didn't even touch on the influence and the ability that Satan has in the world to cause evil, and God's allowing of that. And that's another huge discussion. But when we talk about the logical problem of evil, the only way that it really becomes a problem logically is if you could prove that God doesn't have a morally good reason to allow that suffering to happen.
Right.
Right? And I think the only way you could prove that God doesn't have a morally good reason is if you were to have all the knowledge of God to see what happens. So I don't think that that's actually a good objection to God, because if we can say that God can use it for good, even if you don't like that, that's not an illogical thing, right? But what gets much more difficult is what I would call the emotional problem, which is we can know that God might have a good reason, but when bad things happen to us, it's just awful.
It hurts.
It hurts.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think, no part of this discussion and conversation is meant to take away from the fact that you do have real hurts and pains that are caused because bad things happen to you, around you, by you even. And so, yeah, I know God is good.
Right.
But when my loved one dies, that hurts.
Right.
I know God is good. When my kids blatantly disobey me or just show contempt towards me, right? Like the love is not there in that moment. It hurts.
Yeah.
When I see people suffering, it hurts. When I see poverty around the world and hunger around the world, like those things, they hurt.
Right.
So how do I respond to that then?
I think part of it, it's just so helpful to remember who we know God to be, right? Because God isn't somebody who just says, yes, I've got this good reason for allowing it, so I'm going to sit above the world and just let it play out, and you'll see eventually that it was worth it, et cetera, et cetera. But God came to earth. He came and he lived with us. He came to us in our sorrow. I think back to the story of Lazarus. Lazarus being a good friend of Jesus, and he dies. And Jesus had healed people, and when he hears that Lazarus is sick, he has the time, he has the ability to go back, and we know he's healed people before, and he doesn't. It tells us that he intentionally stays back when his friend is sick, and everybody says, dude, why wouldn't you go help your friend? This is like a good friend. We know you can heal people. And then they hear word that Lazarus has died, and they're like, well, Jesus, you missed the chance. Like, what were you thinking? Why did you have us wait here? And he goes back, and again, he doesn't just be like, all right, one day he'll come back and blah, blah, blah. But the sister of Lazarus comes out and is just crying and said, if you had been here, like accusing Jesus, if you had just been here, my brother would be fine. And what does Jesus do? I mean, he doesn't reprimand her. He doesn't give her a lecture on why these different truths exist and so you can trust in God. Like, he doesn't do all that, even though all that's true. But it just says he weeps.
He wept, yep.
He just takes her and he cries and he enters into that sorrow with her. He doesn't just say, deal with it, it'll get better eventually. He says, I'm here with you during this. And then he does make it better, right? We see Lazarus raised. But in that moment of Jesus with us weeping, I think we can take comfort in the fact that we have a God who cares enough to endure the suffering himself with us.
So we know bad things happen. We know that, sure, there's a reason that's beyond what we can see and understand for most of it anyway. And then that Lazarus illustration, seeing the way that Jesus interacted there, it gives me this small picture of, I think, the bigger picture, right? You had said Jesus there, he endured, stepped into, is hurting and suffering with us. So we have a God who is actively involved in caring in the lives of his children. And so when we're hurting, he's hurting. And I think he wants us to bring to him our hurts, right? And so in my hurt, my pain, I can cry out to God, and he's there.
Right.
And he loves me and he comforts me. Going back to your illustration about giving shots to our kids and vaccines, what do they do after they get that shot? We're holding them so the nurse can shoot them, and then what happens? They come to us for that comfort. Right? They don't then blame us as, you did this. Maybe as they get older and they can process that differently. But like the naivety of the young kids, and I don't use that word in jest. I mean, their brains just haven't developed. They haven't been negatively influenced as much, and so they see that, okay, my parent allowed this to happen, but my parent's the one that's going to comfort me through this. I still trust them. I love them. That's God.
Yeah.
Sure, God is all powerful. He could just stop the hurt.
Right.
But I think that would go against his desire to love us and grow us and change us and shape us more and more to the image of Jesus.
Right.
If the end goal of all of this is for us to be made right with Christ and to be resurrected again, Lazarus, there was hurt, there was pain, there was weeping. It was made right.
Right.
Jesus raised him.
Yeah.
Right? And so for us, there's hurt, there's pain, there's weeping. But when we place our faith in Jesus, there is resurrection that comes after that.
Right.
Right. And I think of what Jim shared with us in the conversation after last week in Luke chapter 13, when Jesus says, there is that pain, there is that hurt, death happens. You know that. Repent, right? Come to me, trust in me, or death happens.
Right.
Right? The wages of sin is death. Our broken, fallen world, the penalty for that is death. But Jesus paid that for us so that when we put our trust in that, we don't have to experience that final death. We get to experience, like Lazarus, a resurrection from the dead, which is ridiculously awesome to think about, right?
Right. Especially since we started this with the finding that we aren't good.
Right.
But here's what God is doing. That's awesome. That's good news. When we say the gospel is good news, that's why we say it.
It is good news, yeah.
Cool.
All right, hey, join us in the chat on Zoom afterwards to hang out. We can talk more about this, answer your questions, and just hang out and see each other. Go to dfchurch.com. You can find the link there to get to Zoom, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.